What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and today we're going to try out an episode in a potential series that I wanted to do back in Battle for Azeroth when I first started the channel, but it was already really late in the expansion when I came up with the idea. As a rogue, I love finding ways to cheese mechanics so that way I can take care of things easier for my group in a dungeon. Or at least that's what I tell them, and it's really just so I can pad the meters a little bit more. Either way, whenever I first enter a dungeon, or an encounter, or a boss fight, or anything where there's some crazy hard-hitting move, or some really annoying mechanic, the first thing I think of is, can you cloak it? Well, this series will hopefully go over every annoying ability that trash and bosses have in every dungeon for Shadowlands, so we'll be starting with Necrotic Wake for the first episode of Can You Cloak It? Cloak of Shadows has gone through a lot of ups and downs throughout its many iterations in World of Warcraft, and it is currently a 2-minute cooldown which will remove all harmful spell effects from you, and make you immune to future spells and harmful effects for 5 seconds. This can be an exceptionally powerful defensive to help mitigate all damage you would normally take, as well as having ways to make mechanics completely trivial in some situations. Necrotic Wake has a number of boss mechanics and trash mob abilities that this will prove to be very effective on, so we'll go through each section of the dungeon in order. Feel free to skim through the video to whatever sections or bosses you're most interested in, as I'll have the video timestamped to all the various sections that I'll be going over. So we'll start with the trash leading up to Blightbone, the first boss. There are a number of trash mobs we can immune their effects from in this area, though none of them that I would really deem worth using Cloak on, especially since it will be very useful on the first boss. The Blight Bags, those little jumpy nasty things, will put out an AoE plague damage effect called Disgusting Guts when they die. This will deal a blast of plague damage to nearby players and put a plague damage over time effect on you. This can be cloaked, though again, really not worth doing. The Corpse Harvesters are those fellas with that ever-annoying Drain Fluids cast. This deals plague damage over 4 seconds and stuns the target while it's active. This should basically always be interrupted or CC'd or stunned or something to prevent it if you have to. So while you can use Cloak preemptively to avoid the stun if it's targeting you, this is a complete waste of our defensive since it can be stopped by virtually anything that stops an enemy from casting. The Zul'Ramis Gatekeeper has a number of moves, all of which are shadow damage and can be ignored with Cloak. However, again, this is not really necessary. Necrotic Bolt should always be interrupted, as it's a pretty hard-hitting move that also puts a healing absorb on the damaged player. Whereas Wrath of Zul'Ramis is an AoE pulsing shadow damage that doesn't hit terribly hard, and Clinging Darkness simply will bounce a dot between party members whenever it's dispelled, so there really isn't a need to cloak this because it'll just bounce to somebody else, and after 4 seconds it'll probably end up bouncing back to you anyways. So now we'll talk about the Blightbone boss fight. This big boy has a few abilities that we can make good use of Cloak of Shadows on. His primary and grossest move is Heaving Wretch. I guess he had one too many Kungalooshes because this dude pukes a lot. On the bright side, if he does target you with this nasty move, then you can stop the main hit of nature damage as well as the damage over time effect it applies to us with the trusty Cloak of Shadows defensive. The large green fetid gas puddles are also cloakable, so if you're trying to run through them to regroup with your teammates, then that will work perfectly fine. And the nasty Carrion Eruption dot is cloakable as well that comes from those little worms. So yeah, virtually anything on this boss can be mitigated. I often find myself using Cloak so I can run in and kill all the carrion worms as far away from the group as possible, that way the green puddles take up less space on the floor, but to each their own. Next, we'll be making our way to Amarth the Harvester. There are a number of adds along the way to reach him that have moves we can mitigate, as well as 1 or 2 that might trick you if you don't know what they do. We'll start with Zul'Ramis Necromancer, which you'll probably know is that one guy that as soon as he dies, all of his skeleton minions explode with him immediately. Much like a lot of other enemies in this dungeon, he has the Necrotic Bolt ability, which again is not a priority to Cloak, but he also has the Grim Fate move. This sounds like it'd be something super horrible to have on you, right? Since when you have this debuff, you have this huge green aura surrounding your character and it's ticking down and you don't really know what it's gonna do. Well, don't get baited into using Cloak of Shadows on this because it won't take it off and it actually doesn't hurt you at all. However, any allies within 6 yards of you when this debuff expires after 4 seconds will take a pretty large chunk of shadow damage. So since the spell isn't technically harmful to you, Cloak doesn't remove it, so just make sure you're not standing on top of anybody. Or do and just blame it on lag. Either way. Speaking of trolling people, this situation should never happen, but there is a funny and slightly useful way that you can use Cloak on the Skeletal Marauders. Cloak can be used to immune the AoE fear effect from Rasping Scream. Again, you should definitely be interrupting this move, and it's kind of a bad idea to just cloak it since most likely your entire group is going to be running away like they just saw a really bad WoW fanfic, but you know, sometimes that's good for a laugh. For a slightly more badass trash enemy, we have Narzuda next. He has the same Necrotic Bolt and Grim Fate abilities that we've discussed already, so pretty much no need to cloak either of those moves. He also has Dark Shroud, which is an exceptionally annoying move since it makes him immune to physical damage unless someone dispels him or uses like Arcane Torrent or something like that if you're a Blood Elf. While Dark Shroud persists, it will do some ticking AoE shadow damage, but again, that isn't really enough to warrant wasting Cloak on it, and I'm pretty sure Feint drops the damage from this down a little bit anyways. And now for the Amarth boss encounter. This boss has a few cloakable abilities, so we'll go over those next. Probably the biggest, hardest hitting, and honestly most avoidable move that you can cloak if you find yourself in bad positioning is Necrotic Breath. This is that breath attack that Bonefang does while spinning around in a circle. Not only does this do pretty huge damage every half second that you're standing in it, but it also puts a hefty debuff on you that will reduce healing you receive by 30% for 10 seconds and deal a lot of shadow damage every second as well. Again, you definitely should never be in front of the boss ever, especially while he's casting this. But if, for example, you were off killing skeletons that no one else was interrupting or people weren't switching to and you were pretty far away, then you might find yourself in a less than ideal position when this cast goes off, so cloak and bravely run from your problems. Amarth also spawns quite a few of those skeletal mages that you've seen throughout the dungeons so far. These cast that annoying Frostbolt and even more problematic Frostbolt Volley. Both these and the Necrotic Bolt ability from the boss should be interrupted and CC'd as many times as you can, but if needed, Cloak will stop you from dying to one of these if you're low on health for any reason, as they can all hit really hard. After the Amarth encounter, we'll be heading up to Surgeon Stitchflesh. Although there is a ton of trash in the area, only one new move is worth mentioning here. The Corpse Collector ads will have the Gore Splatter ability, which is an AoE plague damage move that then applies a pretty decent damage over time plague effect afterwards. While this is a very big priority for interrupting, you can always save your own skin by cloaking this off so your healer will have one less person to worry about cleansing or just healing through the damage. But yeah, this cast should be interrupted like every time. For the Stitchflesh boss encounter, there really isn't any good need for Cloak of Shadows here. If for whatever reason you need to run through any of those green puddles on the ground from the Embalming Ichor cast, then Cloak will let you do it, as the puddles do a pretty high amount of plague damage every second you stand in them. The vial of Ichor he throws can be immune with Cloak as well, though I can't really recall ever being targeted with it before, so I can't say if that is a really good use of Cloak, except for maybe on higher tyrannical keys, possibly. And lastly, Nalthor the Rimebinder. Virtually every ability this boss does is frost-oriented damage, though probably the most useful ability that I've found to completely ignore with Cloak is the Frozen Binds debuff. This would normally make anyone who gets picked by the boss frozen in place, requiring others to move away from them prior to them being dispelled. Otherwise, when they're dispelled, the debuff will hit anyone that's in that huge circle, causing them to be frozen. However, if you see the boss is picking you for the next Frozen Binds cast, you can preemptively pop Cloak of Shadows. Doing this will make the spell fail completely, so no one will have to move out from the boss or anything like that. You can also use Cloak during the Frogger phase if you get sent away with Dark Exile, allowing you to just sprint in a straight line and immune everything for as long as Cloak is active. Comet Storm can also be immuned, however I really wouldn't waste Cloak on that because it's really easy to just run in a little circle, allowing you to stay within melee range of the boss if you're running acrobatic strikes without ever getting touched by Comet Storm ever. And there you have it folks, the first episode of Can You Cloak It? Let me know in the comments what you think of the idea, and if there's any cheesy things that I missed with Cloak of Shadows that you can do in Necrotic Wake, then let me know about those too, and I'll leave them updated in the pinned comment that I put on every video. I tried to find and test as many abilities as I could, but with the randomness of some of them, especially for boss abilities and the length of Cloak of Shadows cooldown, it can be a little tricky to know exactly what it does when you use it before, during, or after an ability hits you. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, then maybe consider leaving a comment or a like. Or if you know any other sneaky boy rogues that might find this information useful, then any sharing of the video is massively helpful to the channel's growth and greatly appreciated. As always, I want to extend my gratitude to my regular viewers, commenters, subscribers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.